I was 64, and for the first time in years, the house was quiet by choice, not by absence. The mortgage had been paid off a decade ago, the old orchard still bloomed every fall, and David's tools, though rusted, hung where he'd left them. From the kitchen window I could see the sugar maples beginning to burn gold, the fields breathing in the last warm sighs of October. I should have felt proud. I should have felt safe. But I'd learned something hard even after you've survived loss-planted roots and stood your ground through every storm. Peace isn't permanent. That morning, my son sent me a message that felt colder than any winter we'd survived. "Mom, we need to talk. I have a business proposal. It's about the farm." I stared at the words until they blurred, and something in me, something small but fierce, whispered, "Not this time." The late October sun filtered through the gold-tinged leaves of the sugar maples, casting a warm glow across the rows of apple trees that lined the western edge of my property. I had just finished gathering the last of the fallen apples into a wicker basket when I paused to take it all in. 40 acres of open land, worn fences, and the old white farmhouse with its crooked porch beam. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. More than that, it was the dream my husband David and I had poured our hearts into for nearly 2 decades. We bought the land back in 1993, newlyweds with little savings and big ambition. The soil was stubborn, the winters unforgiving, and the bank never made anything easy. But we made it work. David was a mechanical engineer by trade, but every weekend he'd be out here mending fences, laying irrigation lines, or building something from scrap wood. And I learned to grow things. Not just vegetables and fruit, but a life. A quiet, solid life rooted in this land. When he died in a car accident in 2010, everything stopped. I remember the cold silence of the kitchen the night I got the call, the casserole dishes piling up from church neighbors, the vague words of comfort, and me standing at the sink looking out at the field we'd planted together the spring before. He was just gone. And suddenly this entire farm was mine alone. Andrew was 17 then, already talking about law school. He was the kind of boy who remembered birthdays and always brought his dishes to the sink. Not a drop of our blood connected us, but no one could have guessed that. I'd raised him since he was 2, and in every way that mattered, he was my son. He lives in London now, practicing real estate law. Calls every Sunday like clockwork, and never once asks me for a dime. Daniel, my biological son, is a different story, always the charmer, bright, impulsive, full of grand ideas and shortcuts. He's 35 now and still chasing the next big thing. There was the organic dog treat venture, the artisan beard oil subscription, the food truck that never actually made it past the driveway. Each time he'd come to me with a plan, a pitch, and eyes that reminded me of David's, but without the follow-through. And each time I gave in, I covered the shortfalls, co-signed the loans, let him live here rent-free for stretches of time long after college. Somewhere along the way, helping became enabling, but by then it was hard to tell the difference. I bent down to pick up another apple, the basket now half full, when I heard the shrill ring of the landline coming from the house. My knees groaned as I stood. It was rare for that phone to ring these days. Most people text or call my cell. I walked toward the porch, wiping my hands on the sides of my jeans, and stepped inside. The phone was on the wall beside the pantry. I glanced at the screen before answering. Daniel. Of course it was. I stared at his name for a beat longer than I needed to. The last time he'd called me unprompted, it had been about a loan he didn't call a loan. And before that, it was a temporary cash flow issue that never untemporaried. I sighed and picked up the receiver. Hi, Daniel. Hey, Mom, he said, too cheery, too rehearsed. How's my favorite farmer? I didn't answer that. I'm good. What's going on? Oh, nothing much. Just been thinking about you. And the farm, actually. Here it comes. I was talking to Vanessa last night, he continued, and we were going over some numbers projections. And we realized something. You're sitting on a gold mine, Mom. That land. It's got so much potential. I leaned against the counter, letting the silence draw out. We've got this idea, right? He pushed forward. It's an app, a food supply chain app. Harvest Link. Think Uber meets local agriculture. We're creating a direct-to-table ecosystem, and your farm, it could be the flagship, like the face of it. You want me to sell the farm, I said flatly. No, not sell exactly. Well, yes, technically, but hear me out. We'd use the capital to launch the platform, build infrastructure, get it off the ground. You'd be part of it. Like a legacy co-founder. We'd honor everything you and Dad built. My stomach turned. Daniel, this land isn't just an asset. It's home, Mom, he said. And there was an edge now under the smooth tone. You're 63. You've done the hard part. You've held on long enough. Why not let it become something bigger, because it already is something, I said, my voice tightening. He sighed, and I could hear the irritation bubbling up. I just think you're too close to see what this could be. And there it was. Too old, too sentimental, too blind. I glanced out the window. The sun was dipping lower, and the shadow of the barn stretched long across the grass. I'm not selling, I said simply. I figured you'd say that, he said. Vanessa thinks maybe you just need to hear the full plan. We'd love to sit down with you, maybe grab lunch. Just talk it through. I didn't respond right away. His tone had shifted again. Now light, casual, persuasive, but underneath it I recognized the urgency. This wasn't just an idea, and it was a pitch, one that was already underway. Let me think about it, I said, and hung up before he could try another angle. I stood there a moment longer, staring at the silent phone in my hand. Outside, the wind moved through the dry corn husks like a whisper. I stood in the kitchen, the phone still cradled in my hand, the silence stretching out around me like fog. I set the receiver back on its hook slower than necessary, then pressed both palms against the cool countertop to steady myself. The old wood creaked beneath my weight like even the house was bracing. Too old to understand dreams. The words hit harder than I'd expected. Not just because they came from Daniel, but because they came so easily from his mouth, like a conclusion he'd drawn long ago. As if the years I spent holding this family together had somehow aged me past relevance. I turned and poured a glass of water from the tap, the metallic taste of the pipes lingering on my tongue. My hands were still slightly damp from working in the yard, and I could see a faint streak of dirt under one fingernail. A lifetime of soil, sweat, and scraped knuckles, and apparently none of it counted anymore. 63. That's what I am. But I'm not done. Not even close. I walked toward the back of the house to the office David and I had once shared. His old drafting table still sat by the window, covered now with boxes of canning jars and old tax folders. I pulled down the top drawer of the file cabinet, flipping through labeled folders, until I found the one marked Daniel, Education. Inside, there were old bursar bills from his time at Purdue, check stubs from the semester he dropped 2 classes, and a yellowing letter from the loan office that I'd intercepted before he ever saw it. I'd paid every cent of that loan. Just as I'd floated him during the dog biscuit venture, the men's grooming box subscription, and the retrofitted food truck he parked in front of my barn for 3 months before it got repossessed. All told, I'd sunk about $55,000 into his ideas. None of it returned. None of it even acknowledged. I took the file and slid it into a new manila folder, scribbling Harvest Link History on the tab with a red marker. Then I carried it into the kitchen, dropped it on the table, and stared at it like it might burst into flames. That's when my cell buzzed on the counter. Vanessa. Of course. The preview of her message lit up. Hi, Margaret, just wanted to follow up on Daniel's call. I think we could really do something amazing together. Would love to meet soon. The heart emoji stung more than the words. Vanessa had always been polite in that distant, curated way. Perfect nails, perfect tone, always bringing a salad that no one asked for to family dinners. She never called me Mom, never asked how I was unless it was in front of other people. But now that she needed something, she was using hearts. I didn't open the message. I just turned the phone face down on the counter. I took the kettle from the stovetop, filled it, and set it on the burner. Tea usually helped clear my head. I needed to think about what he'd said, and more importantly, how quickly this was unfolding. They were working on this together, Had been for a while. The pitch was too polished, the numbers too rehearsed. This wasn't a conversation. It was a presentation. And I was the final obstacle. I sat down and stared out the window. The barn was lit gold in the late-day sun. David built that barn with his own hands. Andrew helped paint it when he was 10, getting more white on himself than the siding. Daniel never liked the work. He'd disappear when chores came up. Said the barn smelled like hay and boredom. I sipped the tea once it was ready and let it warm my hands. The clock ticked above the sink, steady and low. Somewhere out in the corn rows a bird chirped sharp and short like an alarm. The next morning I found myself rereading Vanessa's message. Not because I wanted to respond, but because I needed to understand what kind of game they were playing. The second message had come in overnight. Would Friday lunch work? There's a lovely little spot in town, the Willow House, quiet and cozy, great coffee. Just us girls, just us girls. I let out a short, dry laugh. That phrase hadn't been sincere since the 1950s. Still something in me itched to go. Not to negotiate, not to be convinced, but to hear her out on my terms in public, to look into her eyes without Daniel standing behind her feeding lines. I wanted to see the shape of this thing myself. I typed a short reply. Friday at noon. I'll meet you there. No heart, no smiley. When Friday came, I stood at my closet longer than usual. I chose my denim jacket, the one with the reinforced cuffs from years of pruning apple trees. I tied my graying hair back in a neat bun and left my phone on the kitchen counter. If this was going to be a play, I didn't need distractions. The Willow House was exactly the kind of place Vanessa would love. White-painted brick-exposed beams, overpriced lattes with lavender syrup. A chalkboard sign out front read, "Today's intention growth." I stepped inside, and there she was, Alta already seated at a corner table with her laptop open and a latte topped with foam art. She spotted me, stood up quickly, and gave a little wave too wide for comfort. "Margaret." "You look wonderful," she said as I approached. "I love that jacket." So rustic, I gave a small nod and sat down. "Thanks for meeting me," she went on, closing her laptop like she hadn't just been practicing her talking points. "Daniel and I are so excited about Harvest Link. We really think it could be something transformative. Not just for us, but for you, too." I folded my hands around the warm ceramic mug the barista placed in front of me. Black coffee. No foam, no syrup, no nonsense. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "We see your farm as the heart of the project. It could be our flagship, the proof of concept. You'd be part of something bigger." I kept my gaze steady. "You mean I'd sell it to you?" "Well, technically, yes," she said, still smiling. "But think of it as unlocking potential. You'd be a partner, a legacy name. Think of it as evolution." I didn't answer right away. I took a sip of coffee and let the silence grow long. Finally, I said, "Vanessa, this farm isn't an idea to me. It's not potential or leverage. It's a life, a marriage, a burial ground for every version of myself I've ever been." She blinked, lips parting slightly. "I'm not selling it," I said quietly. She tried to recover, but I was already standing. I left a $5 bill on the table beside my untouched scone and walked out the door without another word. The sun was high, but the wind had turned sharp. They weren't done yet, and neither was I. The house was quiet when I got home, that heavy kind of quiet that settles after you've had to defend your sanity in public. I slipped off my boots by the back door, the soles dusted with gravel from the Willow House parking lot, and stepped into the kitchen. Sunlight spilled through the window above the sink, falling across the old pine table like a memory. I didn't go straight to the kettle this time. Instead, I wandered into the living room, letting my fingers drift along the top of the sideboard. Dust had gathered in the corners. I wiped a little circle away with my sleeve. There was a photo sitting right in the middle, one of those black plastic frames from Walmart I'd always meant to replace. The glass was slightly cracked on the edge, but the image inside was intact. Daniel had his arm thrown around Andrew's shoulders, both of them wearing their graduation caps. Purdue class of 2010. Daniel looked confident, like he already had the world by the collar. Andrew looked like he couldn't believe his luck. I stared at it longer than I should have. I remembered that day, how David had cried during the ceremony but tried to hide it behind his sunglasses. How Andrew had insisted on calling us Mom and Dad in front of his classmates. And how Daniel had left the luncheon early to meet some friends for drinks, texting from the parking lot that he was grateful seriously before disappearing for 3 days. They were so different. Always had been. Andrew was soft-spoken, methodical. He never asked for much, never made a show of things. Daniel, on the other hand, was made of fire and edges. He could charm the pants off a banker or a bartender, but there was always something in him that turned cold the moment you tried to get too close. I used to think it was just a phase. Some boys go through wild years before settling down. But Daniel never did settle. He just got better at looking settled. I walked upstairs, stopping outside each room like I was visiting ghosts. The hallway creaked under my steps. The door to Andrew's old room was still painted navy blue, a color he picked himself. Inside it was bare, except for a shelf with his high school trophies and a few old books left behind. To Kill a Mockingbird, a legal studies prep guide, a Bible with his name on the inside cover. Daniel's room was next door. His walls were still lined with posters, bans a few movie villains, and a framed rendering of a business pitch he'd done in college. The desk was cluttered with things he hadn't touched in years, but that I hadn't had the heart to throw away. A broken pair of headphones, an old flip phone, a Matchbox car he used to carry in his pocket when he was little. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt the weight of it all pressed down on my chest. David's absence hung heavier here than in any other part of the house. I could still hear his voice from that last night when we sat on the back porch with the TV off and a blanket over our legs. He'd said, "If anything ever happens to me, promise me you won't let this place go. It's not just ours, Maggie. It's part of you." I had promised. Downstairs again, I pulled out my ledger from the kitchen drawer, my old-fashioned way of keeping track scribbled in pen with paper clips marking every month. I flipped to the current page, traced the numbers slowly. Social Security, a modest pension from David's old firm, and a small annuity we'd set up in our 40s. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to live to maintain the house, to cover the land taxes and the rising cost of propane each winter. Enough to stay independent. I opened my savings app next. The screen blinked $31,282.16. Not bad, not extravagant, but it meant I didn't need to be anyone's burden. The phone buzzed on the table. Vanessa again. This time it was a voice message. "Hey Margaret, I hope today didn't come off too strong. I really believe in what Daniel's building, and I think you might too if we could just talk without all the noise. Maybe meet for coffee, just us. Woman to woman?" She paused, then added, "Friday's meeting was just the start. We're not giving up. I know you care about your legacy." She always knew how to say things that sounded warm but carried weight. Woman to woman. I played the message twice. The second time I heard the slight tremble at the end. Maybe nerves, maybe frustration, maybe calculation. I didn't delete it. I didn't respond either. Instead, I walked back out to the porch. The sky had shifted bruised pink clouds rolling over the treetops. I sat on the swing David had built, the one with the chain that always clicked on the left side. From this spot I could see the barn, the orchard, the corner of the field where we'd buried Lady, our first Labrador. I could also see the tire ruts Daniel left years ago when he tried to spin donuts on the lawn with his buddy's truck. The scars were still faintly visible in the grass. This land remembered everything. So did I. The porch light flickered on automatically as the sun slipped lower. I stayed there until the wind turned cold enough to raise goosebumps, and only then did I rise, go inside, and lock the door behind me. The Willow House sat on the corner of Main and Cypress, all exposed brick and soft jazz spilling out the open doors. A line of potted lavender flanked the entrance, and a chalkboard easel read, "Intentional living starts with connection." It was the kind of place that served avocado toast on marble slabs and made you feel underdressed if you didn't arrive in linen. I parked my truck 2 blocks away and walked, letting the breeze cut through my flannel jacket. I hadn't been downtown in weeks, not since the farmer's market closed for the season. The air was cool, brittle, with the scent of roasted coffee and wood smoke, and I caught my reflection briefly in the window as I approached. Hair pinned back, face calm, jaw tight. Vanessa was already inside. She stood when she saw me waving with both hands like we hadn't just locked horns days before. She wore a pale yellow blazer over a white blouse, her hair glossy, lips tinted rose. A tablet rested beside her herbal tea and her sunglasses. Designer, no doubt, sat neatly folded at the edge of the table like props. "Margaret," she said brightly, moving to air kiss my cheek. "Thank you for coming. You look so grounded." I nodded, not bothering to interpret that. "I went ahead and ordered you a coffee. Black no sugar, right?" I remembered. I didn't respond. I just sat, placing my purse carefully on my lap. "I hope I didn't overwhelm you with the message," she said, smoothing the hem of her blazer. "I just really believe there's something powerful we can build together. I've been thinking nonstop about your land since the first time I saw it. It's magic." I tilted my head. "You've been to the farm exactly twice." "Well," she said with a gentle laugh, "twice was enough to know it has soul. And that's rare. Most farmland is land. But your place has history. Story. That's why we see it as the perfect launch point for Harvest Link." She pulled the tablet closer and tapped it to life. A sleek logo spun across the screen, a green leaf forming a Wi-Fi signal. Beneath it, the words "Harvest Link Reconnecting America's Roots." It's a platform, she explained, that creates direct access between local farmers and urban families. No middlemen, no corporations, just real food from real people. We want to start with 5 core farms, and yours would be the heart of it all. "And you want me to sell it," I said flatly. Vanessa blinked, lips parting in mock surprise. "Not sell. More like contribute. You'd be a founding partner. We're talking equity, Margaret. Real upside. You'd still be involved in shaping the space. The farmhouse could become a visitor center. Education programs. Kids learning how milk comes from cows, not cartons." She scrolled to another screen. Renderings of my home transformed into a bright whitewashed facility with solar panels and pastel signs pointing to hands-on orchards. The barn was gone, replaced by what looked like a yoga pavilion. "How much are you asking?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Well," she smiled, "we're seeking $650,000 in initial capital. Your property, conservatively, is worth close to $950,000. If you transferred ownership, or even just mortgaged a portion, we could offer you 20% of the equity. And down the line, you'd earn passive income. It's an investment in the future." I reached for the coffee and took a slow sip. "And what happens if the startup fails?" I asked. Vanessa's smile flickered just slightly. "It won't. We've done projections. We're working with an advisor who specializes in scaling ethical food brands, and Daniel's already in conversations with angel investors. This is moving, Margaret." I said nothing. She went on too quickly. "I know it's a lot to absorb, but I also know you care about legacy. I mean, this land has been in your family for 30 years. This is a chance to preserve that in a meaningful way, to make it last." I looked at her. Really looked. Beneath the charm and the words polished like showroom windows, there was something hard, calculating. She wasn't here to offer partnership. She was here to package my life into a brochure and hand me a title that meant nothing once the ink dried. "My husband and I bought that land when we had nothing," I said softly. "We cleared the fields by hand. He died believing I'd keep it safe." Vanessa shifted. "I'm not trying to take it from you, Margaret." "No," I said. "You're just trying to make it yours." She opened her mouth again, but I cut her off. "This isn't just land to me. It's where I buried my dog, where I taught my sons to drive. It's Sunday dinners and lightning bugs and the sound of my husband hammering the new porch rail in July heat. It's mine, and I'm not selling." Her face dropped, the smile retreating in pieces. "I appreciate your time," I added, standing slowly, "but the answer is no. I left a $10 bill beside my untouched biscotti and walked out. The sun had dipped behind the courthouse dome and the wind picked up along the sidewalk. I could feel it through my jacket. Clean and biting like truth. They had their answer. What they did with it next was up to them. The next morning, the phone rang just after 8 a.m. Just as I was setting a kettle on the stove. The number flashed across the screen. Daniel, I let it ring once, twice, then picked up. I didn't speak first. Mom, he said, his voice softer than usual. Hey, listen, I'm sorry about how that came out the other day. I think I pushed too hard. I stayed quiet. The kettle hissed behind me. I let the stress get to me. Vanessa's been pushing too, and I wasn't being fair. Can we just reset? I slowly pulled a mug down from the cabinet, not responding. I was thinking maybe we could come over for lunch this weekend, he continued. Just the three of us, no pitches, no talk of Harvest Link, just a family meal like old times. There it was. That casual tone he used when he wanted something, warm enough to sound human but measured like a PR statement written in his head. I could almost hear Vanessa's script behind it. You want to come here, I finally said. Yeah. Saturday. We'll bring lunch. Your favorite? Roast chicken and sweet potatoes just like Dad used to make. That detail made something twist in my stomach. Daniel barely touched that meal when David made it. But he remembered the performance of it. That counted for something, I guess. All right, I said slowly. Come by at noon. You won't regret this, he said quickly. Thanks, Mom. He hung up before I could answer. I stood in the middle of the kitchen phone, still in my hand. The kettle began to whistle. I reached for it, poured the hot water into the mug, and watched the tea bag swirl as it steeped. My hands were steady, but my chest felt tight. There was nothing casual about this. I walked out to the porch and dialed Andrew. He picked up on the second ring. Morning, Mom. Daniel just called, I said. They want to come for lunch on Saturday. There was a pause on the line. I could picture him blinking behind his glasses, jaw tightening. What's the angle, he asked. Said no pitch. Just a meal. He exhaled through his nose. Do you believe him? No. Good, he said. Neither do I. I didn't say no, though, I admitted. I said they could come. Another pause. All right. Then I'm coming too. Andrew, Mom, you're being set up. I don't know what it is yet, but I've seen this before. I deal with contracts that look clean until you flip to page 6. I've seen people bring cake and poison in the same box. I laughed despite myself. That's dark. It's accurate. I'm flying in tomorrow night. I'll stay at the inn on Route 12, but I'll be close. You don't have to drop everything for this. I'm not dropping everything. I'm showing up for my mother. His voice was firm. It pulled something deep in me, a steadiness I hadn't felt since David passed. All right, I said quietly. Thank you. After we hung up, I sat on the porch swing for a while, watching the morning unfold. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. A squirrel chased another up the old oak near the barn. Life carrying on as if the ground beneath it hadn't shifted. I thought about what Daniel said, that I was too old to understand opportunity, that I was clinging to something dead. Maybe I was. Maybe this house and land had become a museum I kept dusting, but I also knew what it meant to build something from nothing. I knew what it cost to hold it in your hands when others wanted to turn it into a pitch deck. On Friday afternoon, I wiped down the dining room table and pulled out the good plates. Nothing fancy, just ceramic with a blue rim I'd had since the boys were little. I lit a cinnamon candle not for warmth, but for memory. I cleaned without rushing. I wasn't dressing up for them. I wasn't hosting. I was holding ground. By dusk, the house was quiet again. I sat in the living room with a glass of iced tea and stared at the mantel. David's photo still sat there in the same frame it had for 15 years. He was wearing a flannel shirt, holding a wrench, smiling like he knew something I didn't. What would you do? I asked him out loud. The wind outside didn't answer. Saturday morning came with a thin veil of fog. I rose early, stripped the guest bathroom towels, and replaced them with clean ones. Though I doubted either of them would stay long enough to use them, I swept the porch, wiped the windows, then sat and waited. At 11:56, their car pulled up. A black SUV, new, clean, more polished than Daniel's usual style. Probably Vanessa's influence. I smoothed the front of my shirt and opened the door before they could knock. Daniel smiled. "Hey, Mom?" Vanessa stepped forward with a paper bag from Greenhouse Cafe. "We brought lunch." I stepped aside. "You can set it in the kitchen." They moved past me like guests in a rental house, scanning everything with quick eyes. I noticed Vanessa clock the photos on the wall, the antique clock, the absence of anything trendy or modern. She was already rewriting it in her mind. I followed them in and watched her unpack containers. Roast chicken, herb potatoes, kale salad, even a bottle of sparkling water. Daniel took a seat at the table and looked around. "Still feels the same in here." "It is the same," I said, taking my usual chair. We sat down. I picked up a fork but didn't eat. Daniel looked at me, then Vanessa. "So, how have you been?" "Still living," I said. "Still here." "Good," he said, smiling tightly. "That's good." Vanessa sipped her water and kept her eyes down. The room was quiet, full of food, but starving for truth. And I knew without a doubt that whatever came next, it wasn't lunch. The chicken was dry, or maybe it just felt that way in my mouth, each bite harder to swallow than the last. I chewed slowly, listening to the overly polite chatter floating across the table. Daniel asked about the orchard. Vanessa commented on how timeless the dining room felt. I nodded, smiled faintly, and offered nothing more than I had to. They were waiting for something. I could feel it tightening around us like a noose of pleasant conversation. It wasn't lunch. It was staging. When we'd cleared most of our plates, Vanessa reached into her purse. "I know we said no business today," she said, almost laughing, "but since we're all here, I thought it wouldn't hurt to peek at a few ideas, just so you can have time to digest it all. No pressure." She pulled out a thick spiral-bound packet and set it neatly between her linen napkin and the empty casserole dish. I stared at it. The word Harvest Link was embossed on the cover in pale green ink, followed by Initial Investment Partnership Terms. Just some draft language, Daniel added quickly. No signatures needed today. But I knew better. I recognized the confidence in their eyes. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an expectation. Before I could respond, Vanessa glanced toward the hallway. "Actually, we thought it would be helpful if you heard it from someone who could explain it clearly." Daniel stood and opened the front door. Two people stepped in. The first was a man in a gray blazer carrying a leather briefcase and looking entirely too comfortable in my home. "Hi, Mrs. Whitaker. I'm Robert Strauss, legal counsel for Daniel and Vanessa. We've just come to walk you through the documents." The second was a woman in a navy suit, crisp and severe. "And I'm Linda Monroe from First Farm Credit Union. I've been advising on financing options should you choose to proceed. Nothing is binding, of course." She smiled like a teacher giving a quiz she knew I hadn't studied for. I stayed seated. They helped themselves to chairs. Robert opened his case, pulling out a second folder, glancing at Vanessa for a cue. She gave a small nod. "This agreement," Robert began, sliding a page toward me, "outlines a partnership framework. You'd retain a symbolic equity stake, 15%, and lend the property as collateral for a seed round of $650,000. Upon successful launch, returns would begin in year 2. Reasonable, structured, fully secured." He tapped the lower corner of the page where a highlighted section read, "Property 1193 Larkspur Lane Parcel 003B. To be held in trust during evaluation period." Linda chimed in, "It's very common in the startup world. Land isn't liquid, but it's leverage, and this would allow us to unlock its full potential." I picked up the page. The text blurred slightly, but I read enough. "You're asking me to put the entire farm up as collateral," I said. Vanessa leaned in, still smiling. "Technically, the trust would protect you. It's a short-term mechanism to ensure operational liquidity, and if the business fails," I asked. There was a pause. "Well," Robert said smoothly, In that unlikely case, the trust structure would empower the lending institution to reclaim assets. But that's a worst-case scenario. Linda didn't flinch. I set the paper down. My hands were steady. I'd like to review this thoroughly, with my own lawyer. Vanessa blinked, smile faltering just slightly. Of course, she said after a beat. We assumed you might want to, but time is of the essence, Daniel interrupted. Our investor pool is ready. Delays could shift everything. I won't be rushed into putting my home on the line, I said quietly. Silence dropped over the table like a lead curtain. Vanessa cleared her throat and began stacking the empty plates. Well, she said with forced brightness, we can leave the documents here. Take your time. Just know, we really believe this is the future. Robert and Linda stood. Linda handed me a sleek business card. Let me know if your counsel has any questions. We're happy to liaise. I nodded, but said nothing. Daniel hovered at the doorway as they prepared to leave. You always said you wanted to leave a legacy, he said, voice low. I met his eyes. And I will. But not like this. He looked away first. When the door shut behind them, I waited until I heard the SUV pull out of the driveway before I touched the folder again. I gathered every sheet, every glossy page, and slid them back into the envelope. Then I opened the drawer of the hutch and placed the entire thing beneath a stack of old seed catalogs. Let them wait. I spent the rest of that Saturday evening walking slowly through the house room by room as though reacquainting myself with an old friend who had weathered a storm in silence. In a way, that's what it felt like. The house had watched, endured, absorbed. Now it was my turn to prepare it for what was coming next. In the living room, I rolled up my sleeves and wiped down the coffee table, then took a damp cloth to the mantel where dust had begun to gather under the base of David's photo. The frame was chipped on the edge. I'd been meaning to replace it for years, but never had the heart. I cleaned it gently and set it back into place, the spot under the window where the floorboards creaked. I tightened the screws. The loose corner of the rug, I taped it down. I polished the wood on the dining table until it shone, then rearranged the chairs, just so as if the symmetry might give me some kind of strength. Above the table hung the chandelier David installed himself in '94. One of the bulbs had gone out. I climbed the stepladder, changed it, then stood there a moment with one hand on the chain, just breathing. These small acts. Cleaning, fixing, restoring. They weren't just chores, they were declarations. This house would not be taken lightly. Not by contracts, not by pressure, not by anyone who thought they could sweet-talk me into surrender. I moved to the entryway cabinet where I kept the photo albums. As I dusted the edges, I noticed a hairline crack in the corner of the wall near the baseboard. Probably there for years, maybe, since the foundation settled in the early 2000s. I took a small brush, smoothed a line of plaster into it, and repainted it with the leftover beige from the kitchen wall. It dried quickly, disappearing almost completely. Later that afternoon, I heard the screen door creak and a familiar voice call out, "Margaret, you home?" It was Emily Turner, my neighbor from 2 farms over. She walked in holding a mason jar of wildflower honey, wearing that same worn denim jacket she always had in spring and fall. "Figured you could use this," she said, handing it to me, fresh from the hives. "Well, second batch. First one's already gone to the church bake sale." I smiled. "Thanks, Em. Come sit." She settled into the armchair across from me, her gray curls frizzing at the temples. "I heard there's been some commotion." "That obvious, huh?" "It's a small town, Margaret. Someone sees a stranger in a suit pull into your driveway, it only takes 10 minutes for it to reach the hairdresser, the post office, and both ends of the county." I chuckled, but then I sighed. "They're trying to push me into a deal I don't want," I said. "Vanessa and Daniel. They brought a lawyer, a banker, tried to serve it on a platter of roast chicken and polite smiles." Emily leaned forward. "You gonna sign anything?" "No." "Then you've got nothing to worry about. Just remember who you are. They're hoping you'll forget." I nodded slowly. "Sometimes I wish David were here, just to say you're not crazy. He wouldn't need to." You already know you're not, Emily said firmly. You built this, you protected it. You don't owe anyone the soil under your feet. She stayed for half an hour, sipping the sweet tea I poured, and giving me quiet company. When she left, she hugged me tighter than usual. Don't let them wear you down, Maggie, she whispered. Not for anything. That evening, I drove out to St. Paul's, the small white church at the edge of Millbrook. The sun was setting behind it, casting long shadows over the pews inside. I found Pastor John cleaning up after the youth service, folding chairs stacked to the side. He greeted me with a smile and a raised brow. Margaret Whitaker. Now there's a blessing. Don't start flattering me, Pastor. I've come to talk, not to be buttered. He laughed. All right, then. What's on your mind? We sat in the front pew. I didn't know where to begin, so I just started with the truth. About Daniel Vanessa. The startup, the pressure, the documents, the threat behind the courtesy. Pastor John listened quietly, arms folded, nodding as I spoke. When I finished, he sat back, eyes thoughtful. Do you remember what you said to me the day we buried David? He asked. I looked over at him, surprised. No. You said, I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I know I'll never stop protecting what we build. I swallowed. And you meant it, he said. Faith isn't paperwork, Margaret. It's in the choices you make when no one's watching. You don't need a sign. You already made your decision in your heart. I nodded slowly. He wasn't wrong. As I stood to leave, he handed me a small card from his pocket, a verse written in his own handwriting. Stand firm. Let nothing move you. On the drive home, the fields stretched wide on either side of me, golden and calm. The farm came into view just as the sky darkened, the porch light flickering on like it always did. As I pulled into the driveway, my phone buzzed. Andrew? I just landed, he said. I'm grabbing a rental car now. Should be at your place by 10. Drive safe, I told him. I'll leave the porch light on. The gravel crunched beneath tires just after 10:15 p.m. Headlights sweeping across the porch as Andrew's rental car pulled into the driveway. I opened the door before he could knock. He stood there in his navy pea coat, a leather satchel slung across one shoulder, eyes tired but warm. He smiled. Hey, Mom. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. He hugged me tightly, that steady kind of embrace that made everything feel less fragile. You always were the only one who truly saw me, I whispered. He didn't say anything right away. He just held on like he knew I needed the silence more than words. Inside, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, even though neither of us needed it. He set his bag down at the kitchen table and began unpacking folders, tabs, a yellow legal pad, and a silver pen. He hadn't even taken his coat off. We sat together under the soft light of the pendant lamp, steam curling between us. You kept the documents, he asked. I nodded and pulled them from the drawer beneath the phone. The packet felt heavier now, like it had absorbed every strained breath I'd taken over the last week. I slid it across to him. Andrew read in silence, flipping pages slowly, his brow tightening. Now and then he made a small sound, half a scoff, half a sigh, but he didn't interrupt himself. He finished one packet, then opened the second file from the banker. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, he pushed the papers aside and sat back, running a hand through his hair. Well, he said, they really didn't waste time dressing this up. I waited. This isn't just aggressive, Mom. It's predatory. The language is vague on purpose. It talks about a joint partnership structure and liquidity access agreements. But what it really means is once you sign, the property ownership transfers into an operational trust with Daniel and Vanessa as co-managers. You lose majority rights immediately. My stomach turned. It gets worse, he continued. There's a clause buried in the second half. If the company fails to secure second-round funding within 12 months, the trust dissolves and assets are liquidated to cover losses. You mean they could sell the farm outright? He nodded grimly. Without needing your approval. I stared at the papers, then at him. And Daniel knew he had to. No one signs off on a legal structure this complicated without understanding what it really means. I leaned back in my chair. He looked me in the eye. Told me I'd still have a voice. Andrew's expression hardened. Some people learn to lie with a smile. I looked down at my hands. Weathered, strong, trembling just a little. So what now? I asked quietly. He opened his satchel again and pulled out a different folder, this one labeled Independent Legal Review, Whitaker Property. I had a friend in Chicago look it over on the flight. We've got everything we need to push back, but I think we should do it smart. He laid out a clean sheet of paper, drawing a box around a date, Tuesday, 5 p.m., and underlined it. We set a meeting, not at their house, not here either. Neutral ground. Your lawyer's office. We make it official. Vanessa and Daniel want this to feel casual because that gives them power. We flip it. Make it formal, legal, transparent. I breathed in slowly. They'll come, he said, already pulling out his phone. Vanessa won't let this slip away. But they need to know you're not coming alone anymore. He dialed, then put the phone on speaker. It rang 3 times before she answered. Vanessa's voice came through sugar-laced and surprised. Good evening, Vanessa. My mother and I reviewed the documents. We'd like to invite you and Daniel to a proper sit-down to go over everything. Tuesday at 2 in her counsel's office. There was a pause. Her counsel. Vanessa echoed. Yes, Andrew said calmly. My mother has retained legal representation. We'll be reviewing the terms line by line. Another pause, this time longer. I imagined her sitting in their condo, scrambling for control. Well, she said slowly, that sounds reasonable. I'll speak to Daniel. But yes, I'm sure we can make that work. Good, Andrew said. We'll see you then. He ended the call without waiting for a goodbye. Silence settled again. I exhaled and looked across the table at my son. You've always been the quiet one, I said softly. Andrew smiled just a little. Quiet doesn't mean weak. No, I said. It means knowing when to speak. He nodded, then finally took off his coat. I poured us both another cup of coffee. The hands of the clock ticked toward midnight. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt ready. The conference room at Whitaker and Pine Legal felt nothing like my home. Sleek wood paneling, frosted windows, a muted clock ticking somewhere behind me. There was no scent of cinnamon or soil. Only the sharp tang of professionalism. That suited me just fine. At exactly 2 p.m. The door opened. Vanessa entered first, dressed in her trademark cream blazer, eyes alert and jaw tight. Daniel followed, expression unreadable, his suit pressed within an inch of its life. Behind them, Robert Strauss, their lawyer, clutched a black binder and gave a curt nod, while Linda Monroe from the credit union trailed in last clipboard tucked to her chest. I stood as they approached and gestured toward the chairs across from us. Thank you all for coming, I said calmly. Then I turned slightly and nodded toward Andrew, who was already seated beside me with a neat stack of documents in front of him. This is my counsel. Andrew Whitaker. Vanessa blinked. Robert cleared his throat. Your counsel is your son. Andrew gave a small, deliberate smile. Licensed in Illinois and the UK corporate litigation. But today I'm just here to protect my mother's interests. Shall we begin? No one objected. Andrew opened the folder and slid a few pages forward. Before we get into any specifics about the proposed partnership, he began, I think it's only fair to ensure we're all working with complete information. He glanced toward Daniel. To start, Harvest Link as a brand, your intended venture, was denied federal trademark status last month due to name conflict with an existing agricultural software firm out of Oregon. Public record. We verified it this morning. Daniel shifted. We've appealed. Andrew held up a hand. Sure, but as it stands now, any branding, marketing, or legal operation under that name is potentially exposed to litigation. Vanessa looked at Daniel sharply. Andrew continued. Second, financial history. Daniel, I reviewed filings on your previous ventures, Bloom Harvest LLC AgriConnect Inc., and Greenseed Group, all dissolved all within 2 years of launch. Combined liabilities exceed $480,000. No record of those debts being resolved. Daniel's face went rigid. Those were early ventures, learning curves. I respect learning, Andrew said. But when learning costs others nearly $500,000, it becomes a pattern. Vanessa turned in her seat slightly. What liabilities? We had a plan, Daniel said tightly. We've moved past those. Andrew didn't flinch. And finally, Vanessa, while you've been presented as a co-founder, you hold no equity stake in the proposed trust documents, nor are you listed on any legal registration. Meaning, unless my mother signs over control, you have no legal authority in this matter. Vanessa's mouth parted slightly. Daniel told me I was. You're not, Andrew said simply. Robert leaned forward, trying to recover ground. These are early drafts. Of course, nothing is finalized. Adjustments can be made if your client wishes. My client does not wish. Andrew said, what she wishes is clarity. And she now has it. Linda the banker shifted uncomfortably. Look, our role was only advisory. We were under the impression this was a cooperative agreement. It's not cooperative if one party is misled, Andrew said evenly. Silence followed. I watched Vanessa's eyes as she looked at the documents. Her fingers twitched at the edges of her skirt nails, tapping once against her wedding ring. Then she turned to Daniel. When were you going to tell me about the trademark rejection? She asked quietly. Daniel stiffened. I didn't want to worry you. We had options. And the debt. Her voice cracked slightly. I was handling it. No, Daniel. You were hiding it. She stared at him. From me? From your own mother? He looked away. Robert shifted his binder, clearly considering whether it was worth continuing. Linda adjusted her glasses and started gathering her things. Andrew closed the folder calmly and looked at me. I exhaled slow and steady. The room hadn't exploded. It had simply deflated. Vanessa was still staring at Daniel, her face pale and jaw clenched. Across the table, I could see the moment everything started to fall apart. For them. And quietly, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks. Relief. Andrew sat calmly beside me, flipping one last page from his notes, before glancing up at the room. His voice was steady, professional. In the past 5 years, he said Margaret has transferred a total of $70,000 to Daniel Whitaker, across 7 separate transactions. Each categorized at the time as personal support, not loans. No documentation was signed, no repayment plan offered, but that doesn't mean the pattern wasn't clear. Vanessa's lips parted in surprise. Robert shifted slightly in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. Daniel leaned forward, his palms flat against the table. That was investment. Every dollar. She knew that. I looked at him across the polished wood. No, Daniel, I said softly. I gave you that money because I believed in you. I believed in who I thought you were. I didn't ask for repayment because I didn't think I needed to. He rolled his eyes. Then what's the issue? I looked him full in the face. The issue is that I invested in a person, not a fantasy. And the person I invested in would never do what you've done. Silence rang like a bell in the room. Vanessa's expression tightened. She stared at Daniel like she didn't quite recognize him. Andrew didn't say anything more. He just closed his folder and placed it neatly in front of him, hands folded. The kind of stillness that came not from exhaustion but resolve. Daniel blinked, mouth opening slightly as if he had a comeback waiting. Some script, some excuse, but nothing came out. I stood. The scraping of the chair echoed against the walls. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I didn't cry. I simply spoke the truth, and I spoke it like a full stop. This meeting is over. I believe we're done here. Vanessa started to rise, collecting her things in silent movements. Linda was already halfway to the door. Robert nodded stiffly, gathering his files. Only Daniel stayed seated frozen, like he hadn't expected this outcome to exist in the realm of possibility. I walked to the door and opened it. I'd like you all to leave my house now. It was Andrew who stood next, quietly stepping beside me. Daniel finally rose, his eyes darting between me and Andrew like he couldn't decide whether to lash out or apologize. But in the end, he did neither. His mouth opened, but no words came. He closed it again. Vanessa passed him without looking back. They left together, but not side by side. She walked 2 steps ahead, her heels clicking sharply against the porch wood. Daniel followed slowly, his shoulders sagging. When the door clicked shut behind them, I stood still for a moment. Andrew placed a hand gently on my shoulder. I exhaled. The tension hadn't left my body yet, but it was shifting, no longer a storm swirling inside me, just a wind that had finally passed. The quiet after they left was different from the silence that had weighed on the house before. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was spacious. Daniel and Vanessa didn't say a word when the door closed behind them. Not a final protest, not a parting insult. They crossed the porch, one after the other, and disappeared down the gravel drive without looking back. Robert gave a stiff nod as he passed through the foyer, avoiding eye contact. Linda offered a short, awkward smile. More apology than politeness. Then followed him out. The screen door clicked behind her. The house, once again, belonged only to me. Andrew and I didn't speak for a long time. We stood in the kitchen, letting the quiet settle. The kettle clicked off behind us, water boiled but untouched. Eventually, I poured us both a glass of iced tea instead, and we stepped out onto the front porch. The sun had dropped behind the maple trees, casting long golden streaks across the yard. A breeze stirred the wind chimes, soft and irregular. The shadows of the barn stretched toward us like old friends returning after a long journey. I sat in my usual chair, the cushions still warm from the day. Andrew sat beside me, arms resting on his knees, eyes on the field. "Feels different, doesn't it?" I asked after a while. He nodded, like the air's cleared. It had. For years I'd been bracing for something, waiting for the next favor Daniel would ask, the next promise he wouldn't keep, the next silence after I sent money. But now that tension was gone. The worst had come, and I had not given in. A car pulled into the driveway just before sunset. For a second my heart tensed, but then I recognized the old silver Honda. Emily. She climbed out, carrying a casserole dish wrapped in a towel, her boots scuffing the porch as she came up. "I figured tonight called for baked ziti," she said, handing it to me like a medal. I laughed. "You always know." She glanced at Andrew, then back at me. "So it happened." I nodded. "They came. We said our piece. And they left," I said simply. Emily's expression softened into something between admiration and concern. She sat on the step beside Andrew, hands resting on her knees. "You stood your ground, Margaret. Most folks would have folded just to keep the peace." "There's no peace in being afraid of your own child," I said. Emily looked out over the field. "Well, I'll tell you what. By tomorrow morning, half the town's gonna know. But for once they won't be whispering. They'll be proud." I didn't care about the town's chatter, not really. But there was something in the way she said it that landed deep. Like after all this time I had finally drawn a line. And it had held. After she left, Andrew and I stayed there on the porch. The cicadas had started their chorus. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and fell quiet again. The sky faded to purple, then indigo, and the porch light clicked on automatically. "You okay, Mom?" Andrew asked. I nodded slowly. For the first time in a long while, I said I'm not waiting for something bad to happen. I'm not dreading the phone ringing or a knock at the door. I'm just here. And that's enough. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We sat side by side in the deepening twilight, 2 generations of Whitakers, watching the land we had both protected in different ways. For once, there was nothing left to defend, only something to keep. 1 week later, the farm smelled of late summer hay and warm soil. The wind carried the scent of goldenrod and the faint sweetness of apples ripening on the east side of the property. I'd always believed the land spoke softly, but now I was finally quiet enough to hear it. Andrew and I walked the edge of the pasture with Emily trailing just behind, carrying a thermos of coffee and a tin of lemon shortbread. The three of us made an odd little group, mother, son, neighbor. But it felt right. "This fence line," I said, stopping beside the western boundary. "David and I built it in '94. With our own hands, just the two of us." He hit his thumb 3 times and blamed the hammer. Andrew smiled, touching one of the posts. "It's held up," he said. "It has," I nodded. "Some things still do." We passed the tool shed and the old chicken coop, now empty, and reached the far oak tree that shaded the back of the property. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet that didn't ask anything of you. Just let you be. "This isn't just dirt and grass," I said. "It's where your father taught you to drive the tractor. It's where I sat with you when you scraped your knees. It's where I buried the first dog that ever loved me." Andrew looked around with a softness in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. "It's where you built a life," he said. I nodded. "From nothing." Emily poured us each a bit of coffee, handing it over without a word. She looked out at the horizon, her expression thoughtful. "I've seen a lot of folks try to start over," she said, "but not many who stood their ground and stayed. You're one of the few." We sat beneath the oak for a moment, letting the sun warm our backs. The sky was wide and clean. The air smelled like peace. A familiar pickup truck rumbled up the driveway, and Pastor John climbed out slowly, carrying a small paper parcel wrapped in butcher's twine. He waved as he approached. "Hope I'm not intruding," he said, handing me the package. "Some peach bread from the church bake sale. Thought it might go well with whatever coffee you've got brewing." "It does," Emily said, holding up the tin. He sat on the grass, legs stretched out. For a while we shared stories, about the town, about old memories, about the way life moved forward whether we were ready or not. When the sun began its slow descent, Pastor John stood and brushed off his jeans. "You've done more than keep a house standing," he said. "You've reminded this place what rooted really means. This isn't just land, it's a lived life." As he left, Andrew turned to me, serious now. "If he ever comes back," he said, "you won't be alone. I'll protect this place with you. Always." I didn't need the promise to believe him, but it still warmed something in me to hear it. No one, I said, has the right to take away a dream I've already lived. We walked back toward the house, the three of us side by side. The porch light came on as the sky turned amber. Inside, the rooms were clean, still familiar. I stood in the doorway and looked back once more. The wind rustled the tall grass, and somewhere in the field a bird sang once and flew off. To anyone listening now, maybe you've been told you're too old to matter, too small to resist, too soft to fight. Maybe someone tried to sell you a version of your life that didn't fit the shape of your soul. But if you have a dream, one built in real soil, with real sweat, with real love, protect it. No matter who questions it, no matter who demands it, no matter how loud the world gets. You are the only one who knows the cost of what you've built, and you are the only one who can decide if it's worth keeping. And if you ask me, it always is.